So I think China is concerned, and there are indeed big stakes that we're talking about. For example, China's relationship with Europe and also the potential secondary sanction from the United States. So it does pose very big questions to China. But I wouldn't say that this is the most challenging situation that Beijing has ever found itself in. And so far, I think China has tried to maintain a balancing diplomacy.
For weeks, we have seen China walking this diplomatic tightrope. They're caught between, I guess, what the West wants and what Russia wants. Is it in Beijing's interest to get involved, to take a stance?
Well, it depends on what the stance is. Because for Beijing, I don't think the answer is that we are for Russia, we're pro-Russia, or we're against Russia. I think the Chinese are trying very hard to avoid that dichotomy, that narrative is binary, black or white. You're either with Russia or you're against Russia. I think the Chinese are trying to charter a third way out of this, which is, well, we're not for Russia and we're not against Russia. We are for justice. We see that Russia's position has some of its legitimate reasons, but at the same time, Ukraine's sovereignty also needs to be respected. So I think the Chinese are trying to avoid the framing that China is either with Russia or against Russia.
Does Beijing have anything to gain from the Ukraine crisis if it were to join with Russia or side with Russia?
Well, the funny thing is China does not need to side with Russia to gain from this crisis. The crisis itself is a de facto distraction for the United States and dragging US back to the European theater from its Indo-Pacific focus. So China does not need to be a party, does not need to side with Russia for this distraction to happen. So I think the answer to your question is, does China have anything to gain? Yes, China has a lot to gain from this crisis. But does China have a lot to gain from siding with Russia? I think the cost is much higher for China.
There has been reports that Moscow has asked Beijing for military assistance. Do you think it's likely that China would provide this type of assistance, and what would be the repercussions if it did?
I think it's highly unlikely, and the primary reason is because it does not offer China any deniability. If you offer military assistance, it's on the battlefield, the other side will capture some of the equipment or capture some of the weapons, then it will put China on spot that, well, this is Chinese weapon. And then China will undeniably being defined as having sided with Russia. Based on the Chinese modus operandi, I don't think China will put itself in such a risky situation, especially now that US has already basically preemptively address that issue by saying that, well, China is open to it. Then everybody will be watching, and I think it will make it much more difficult for China to make that commitment.
Could Beijing play a part in helping to end this war? Would that be something that they have the ability to do?
I sense mixed feelings in China. That on one hand, they don't like war, of course, and this war is taking a toll in terms of China's reputation, China's relationship with Europe, and China's credibility. So there's definitely a drawbacks from this war for China. But on the other hand, I think when China looks at the US-China relations and looks at the deterioration of the bilateral relations with the US and how this war is serving as a distraction for the United States, I think there's a strong feeling or strong argument in China that, well, maybe this war is not against China's interest anyway, in the long run. That if Russia is able to distract the United States, the US cannot focus its full force on China alone, because China is identified as the more strategic threat to the United States. I think an argument can be made that I think there are strong arguments in China that maybe this war is not that bad for China. But I think so far, China has had an initial period of extreme discomfort with the war because China was caught by surprise. But after that initial period, I think when China takes stock of the pros and cons, I think the Chinese answer would be, well, we don't want the war to continue, and we don't want the war in the first place. But coming to ending this war, it's not like China hold the key to ending this conflict either, because I think Putin's decision making is quite obscure for outsiders. We did not anticipate that he would launch the attack, and I think it would be not fair to say that that he could be stopped if China tells him to. So I, in this sense, I don't believe that China has a critical role to play to end this war.
Now, Wang Yi recently slammed any comparisons between Ukraine and Taiwan. But do you think that Beijing will be watching the West's reaction to the Ukraine crisis to serve as reference if Beijing were to reunify with Taiwan?
In terms of the military operation, there are a lot of lessons that Beijing is learning from the Ukraine crisis. Like, for example, the role that social media plays, the effectiveness of the local mass resistance against a foreign invasion, and also what is the most effective military strategy in order to achieve what they call the swift and decisive military victory on the battlefield. So I think on the technical level, there are a lot of things that China has to learn. But another takeaway, which is probably on a higher strategic level, is that in the Ukraine crisis, United States refrained from military intervention throughout the past 20 days. And the expectation is that the US is not going to militarily intervene. So I think that begs the question, which is also the most essential question coming to China's decision on Taiwan, which is, will US step in, or US will refrain from intervention militarily in Taiwan, in the case of a Taiwan contingency as well?
Yun Sun, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.